Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 29. I'm glad to say that most of those who were listed as winners in the last Drydock episode have got in contact with me. I'm going to give the one or two who haven't another week or so to contact, and if not, then next episode you will hear a couple of new winners being chosen. Anyway, with that little bit of housekeeping done, let's get on to question time. Ushio01 has a two-part question. Question part first. Would the Royal Navy have been better off decommissioning the R-class battleships and then reusing the guns and turrets on the King George V's over the 14-inch guns they actually did use, as it would have allowed the King George V's to enter service faster? And part the second, what is the difference between a monitor, a breastwork monitor, and a coastal defence ship when, depending on the nation building them, they could have had main guns of the same calibre? So for the second part, the difference between a monitor and a breastwork monitor is effectively defined by that one key term, breastwork. So this came about because, as many of you probably know, USS Monitor, famous of Hampton Roads, managed to sink in a storm because the water just overwhelmed it with its incredibly low freeboard. And before that, there had been a number of incidents where it nearly sunk due to rough weather. Other US monitors suffered similar threats to their survival due to rough weather, and so it was identified that effectively the armoured raft with a turret stuck on it was probably not the best thing to use, even for a coastal defence unit of some sort, simply because even transiting up and down the coast with a ship like that was incredibly dangerous. So a breastwork monitor was an attempt to retain the advantage of having virtually zero target profile, whilst also not sinking horribly the next time a wave above 3 foot came along. And this meant that what you were looking at was effectively a monitor type design, but with a collapsible breastwork, with effectively collapsible panels around the edges, which gave the ship an artificially higher freeboard, which would allow it to sail around in rougher weather quite happily without being at risk of being overwhelmed by the sea. It was acknowledged that obviously in battle these things would be shot away and riddled very quickly, so that's why they were designed to be collapsible, so you could just drop them out and to minimize your target profile again. Over time, obviously, these things, as they inevitably do, began to get more and more permanent, and the freeboard started rising on monitor type ships. But initially, the breastwork monitor was, yes, literally just a standard monitor with a bit of extra paneling to make sure that the freeboard was raised for transit to and from the target area. The coastal defence ship, on the other hand, was different from the monitors in as much as it was an actual ship. So full freeboard, ship type hull design, etc., etc., as opposed to, as we said before, kind of the armoured raft and minimal buoyancy of a monitor. And yeah, the coastal defence ships tend to be basically sort of slightly scaled down versions of the ocean-going variants, and that's really about the main difference, apart from also speed. So they're a lot more, ironically, seaworthy than a monitor, despite being a coastal defence ship. And they're mainly so called because they tend to have shallower drafts, which makes them slightly less suitable for sea travel than a full ocean-going ship, but still capable of doing so if they absolutely need to, but obviously designed mostly to hug the coast in shallower waters and defend nation's coastline rather than going out on the offensive as an ocean-going ship would. Of course, in all cases, except for shore bombardment monitors, which were developed later on, they needed to have at least a couple of guns of a caliber similar to contemporary era battleships because they were supposed to defend against them to some degree, at which point it was pointless not to have a weapon capable of actually hurting the thing you're supposed to be defending against. As far as question part the first, I don't think they would have been better off, to be honest. I mean, yes, in theory, you could reuse the guns and that would cut down on the commissioning time a little bit, but at the same time, the King George V's are designed to use 3 turrets, obviously with very different sized barbette rings to the twin 15-inch 42s that the R class had. And so you need to redesign them and add another barbette ring. And for those of you who have already caught up with where I'm going with this train of thought, what you're effectively asking is, would it have been better to build, well, 6 Vanguard class rather than 5 King George V's and Vanguard itself? Well, yes and no. If they had done a Vanguard style upgrade of the turrets, supercharged the shells, etc., then arguably, yes, probably the building 6 Vanguards would have been a bit better than building all the King George V's, although then the King George V's would not have been treaty compliant at the time that they were ordered, so you would have had to delay the actual building of the hulls to a point where you could reasonably invoke the escalator clause, albeit that only has to be by a few months, similar to the USS North Carolina and Washington's build times. So yeah, you would have got more effective ships, I think, but you've also got the fact that Vanguard is also treaty breaking in displacement, although, again, it would be an interesting scenario where Britain becomes the treaty breaking power. Well, at least officially, the one who actually says, you know what, stuff it, we're building these ships in excess of the 35k displacement limit, as opposed to Japan, which had just walked away and said we're not obeying any of the rules whatsoever. The main problem would be that at the end of the day, you would have the King George V coming online maybe 6 months or maybe a year if you're really lucky, but let's say 6 months earlier than historically. But the Royal Navy now has no R class. Now you might say, well, were they particularly useful? Well, obviously not in frontline duties, but various R class did get around doing various missions, especially in the early part of the war. They had a bit of a will they, won't they kind of thing going with the Japanese fleet in the Indian Ocean at one point. They did serve as very effective convoy escorts, not that they particularly were successful at hunting submarines, but they did serve to deter quite a number of German raiders up to and including Scharnhorst-class battleships. So that sort of almost second-line utility that was gained from the R-class during World War II would have gone away. And you can bet, if you refer back to my video on how to make a stealth battleship, you can bet that if you'd had your only choice was sort of an early Vanguard type, there's no way the Royal Navy would have risked sending one of those out on an overnight raid off the French coast, whereas the R-class at the time, for all the fact that, as I said, they had a lot of utility, were also viewed as slightly expendable. So overall, I would say the Royal Navy would have gotten possibly better ships instead of the King George V's, but the overall outcome, I'd say they wouldn't have been better off strategically by decommissioning the R's for that purpose. Clay Pigeon asks, what are the differences between a proper pre-dreadnought and a mere ironclad ship of the line? So it's a little bit of a tricky field, actually, believe it or not. There is a lot of contention between various authors as to what exactly is the defining mark, but in general, the ironclad battleship had been growing and growing and growing, obviously, since Warrior and Gloire, but they tended to feature a number of rather interesting design paradigms. There were battleships for the ironclad era that were designed as sort of coast assault and local defence ships, which had a very low freeboard. So one of the 19th century HMS Dreadnought or HMS Devastation are good examples of that. They also obviously had what to us would otherwise seem to be absurdly thick armour belts. That sort of 16 to 21 inches wasn't uncommon, but that was because they were mostly using wrought iron, so they needed the extra thickness. Anyway, you also had a very wide and interesting variety of gun armaments, with some people going for multiple smaller guns and others going for some truly absurd-sized ones. You had things like the Victoria and Sansparai wandering around with just a pair of absolutely gargantuan um, guns on the front, and as a result, being among other nicknames, being called the Slippers because they kind of looked like some footwear. So this kind of weird and confused design process for various battleships that didn't really seem to follow any coherent plan was gradually coming to an end in the mid 1880s and late 1880s. So the pre-dreadnought officially is kind of determined to be a battleship with a high enough freeboard for ocean-going work. It has engines capable of at least 16, ideally round about 18 knots. It abandons the monumental, absurd guns of the era in favour of ideally 4 guns, most, if possible, in a pair of twin turrets, one forward, one aft. Secondary battery, generally also have a tertiary battery, and also start to use armour that isn't wrought iron. So basically, so they start dropping down in belt thickness, which allows a lot of other benefits, such as the ability to carry more heavy weapons. The other thing which starts to become a bit of a blurred line is that around this era, there was a lot of debate as to whether or not to use turrets or open barbettes. And so some ships have turrets, some ships have open barbettes. It's generally held that a pre-dreadnought battleship, as opposed to an ironclad, should have a turret, or what is more technically known as a fully enclosed barbette, since the Ericsson and Coles turrets, which were the actual sort of definitive turrets used at the period, were kind of evolutionary dead ends, and what we now think of as a battleship turret was, as I said, is a more accurately described as a fully enclosed barbette. So you can kind of see the evolution taking place if you look at battleship designs of the 1880s, but the ones that are generally held to sit either side of the barrier between ironclad and pre-dreadnought are the Royal Sovereign class and the Majestic class. Although, depending on exactly how you frame the restrictions between ironclad and pre-dreadnought, you could argue that the Royal Sovereigns are actually the first pre-dreadnoughts, or not, but it is a much more contentious point of discussion, whereas I think most people will happily acknowledge the Majestics are very definitely pre-dreadnoughts. So just if you have a quick look at the characteristics of the two, Royal Sovereign and Majestic classes, they both have that necessary high freeboard, they both have the necessary speed, Royal Sovereign being slightly faster at 17.5 knots compared to Majestic 16. They both have 4 main guns with a twins up front and twins at the back. Royal Sovereign's 13.5-inch guns and Majestic's 12-inch guns. This is where one of the differences comes up, in that apart from the subclass which gave a single HMS hood, the Royal Sovereigns otherwise have their guns in barbettes, which means the guns are open and exposed, whereas Majestic has the what we now would today call turrets. They also both have a wide variety of secondary and tertiary weapons, and here is the other main difference between the two that tends to put the Royal Sovereigns just on the ironclad side of the pre-dreadnought debate, which is the belt armour. So the Royal Sovereigns have a maximum thickness of 18 inches on their belt, but this is compound armour, which we'd mentioned in the previous Drydock video, whereas the armour on the Majestics is Harvey steel. So it's much thinner at 9 inches, but offers similar protection. So yeah, hope that helps to define it a bit more for you. As I said, the jury's still out in some cases on in terms of naval scholarship on exactly where the line is drawn, but the line is drawn somewhere between those two classes, so make of that what you will. George Warcrimes asks, how would the Royal Navy react if the Tillman IV-2 type battleships were put to sea in the 1920s? Well, there would be a great dropping of monocles and spilling of tea, and the muttering of words like, oh, utterly unforgivable trespass of treaty obligations. And things like that, because, well, I suppose if you're going to blow through the naval treaty that you yourself have devised and signed in your own capital, driving a Tillman IV-2 shaped hole through it is probably the single most spectacular way you could do so, short of painting gigantic middle fingers on both sides of the prow. To be perfectly honest, if the US had gone down that route, well, the phrase screams externally would probably come quite close to describing the first reaction of most British politicians when the Royal Navy submits the proposed budget for the Royal Navy's response, but a response the Royal Navy would have to have. Quite whether they would go for matching the Tillman IV-2s in some way, shape, or form, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have thought so particularly. They may well sort of resurrect, dust off, and reinvigorate some modified version of the N3 design on the basis that they can build many more of them. And monstrous as it is, the IV-2 is not actually any better protected, and in a lot of parts of it, its design is actually slightly worse protected than an N3 against 18-inch shell fire. So I can see the Royal Navy arguing that some kind of updated N3 built in larger numbers might actually be able to sort of tag team multiple IV-2s. But then again, they did come up with some sketch designs at the end of World War II for some truly monstrous ships that would have required redoing entire dockyards and pretty much the entire Royal Navy infrastructure, so maybe they would have gone with that. But given budgetary constraints and such at the time, I'm more of the opinion the Royal Navy would have come up with some kind of modified N3 design and then tried to build more of them than the US built Tillman IV-2s. Quite whether that would have worked or not is another matter entirely. But yeah, that would have been interesting. Airplane Master 1 asks, what is the full unabridged schedule for cleaning an Age of Sail era vessel? Maybe for both underway and in port. Well, generally speaking, for your general cleaning, there isn't a schedule. It's an forever ongoing task. If you aren't fighting or sailing or sleeping or eating, you would be expected generally to be cleaning. Because cleaning a wooden vessel in the middle of one of the harshest environments known to man, that being the open sea, is just a permanent and ongoing thing. You can't ever stop, really. Occasionally you would actually stop the ship to repaint it, but to be honest, the only real scheduled part of cleaning for an Age of Sail era vessel would have been to degrowth the underside of the ship. Obviously, this got slightly easier with the advent of coppering the ships, as it was much easier to get marine growth off of the copper plates than it was to dig them out of the wooden planks of the hull. Initially, this was done by a process known as wearing the ship, which was literally sail the ship up onto a very shallow bit of water at high tide, let the tide go out, leaving the ship intentionally stranded on sand or some other suitable beach material, and then as the ship lowers onto the seabed, you get a bunch of ropes, very carefully tilt it to one side. Everyone goes off, scrapes everything off, and then repeat the process for the other side on the next tide. Obviously, as ships got bigger, this became less and less practical, and ships started to go into dry dock for this cleaning purpose. When a ship was on long side, obviously they would do sort of kind of like a really sort of stem to stern clean out as well before the ship was put into ordinary, which was the period term for putting a ship into reserve status, or possibly being refitted. So yeah, sorry. I mean, I could point you in the direction of numerous day-to-day cleaning schedules for an Age of Sail era vessel at sea, but these vary from ship to ship, and as I say, it's more kind of like the cleaning of the ship of Theseus rather than the building of the ship of Theseus, if you get the idea. Hellstrike asks, how would the US Navy have fared against the High Seas Fleet if, for some reason, they had a Jutland-like battle in 1915? So the answer here is not particularly well. There are a number of reasons for this, which we'll look into briefly now. Primarily, the Germans at this point, with the High Seas Fleet, can deploy a maximum of 17 Dreadnought-type battleships. That's all of the 11 and 12-inch armed ships that they built. There's quite the gap between Kronprinz coming into service in November 1914 and the next commissioned ship, which is Bayern in 1916. They also have battle cruisers, which the US doesn't have any of. So you've got Von der Tann, Moltke, and Goeben. Although I guess Goeben might be stuck in the Ottoman Empire if we're putting this in a World War I scenario. You've got Seydlitz and you've got Der Flinger. So you've got 4, possibly 5, definitely on our side, depending on what we do with Goeben. And then you've got Lützow, which commissions historically in August 1915. So depending on whereabouts in 1915 we are putting this battle, there may be anything up to 6 German battle cruisers present. But let's average on 5 for the sake of argument at this point. So against an average possible maximum of 22 Dreadnought-type capital ships, the US can marshal 10 battleships of its own and no battle cruisers. So you've got the 2 South Carolinas, the 2 Delawares, the 2 Floridas, the 2 Wyomings, all of those being armed with 12-inch guns, and New York and Texas, with the Nevada class not commissioning until 1916. In capital ship terms, then, the US Navy is outnumbered more than 2 to 1 if you lump the German battle cruisers in with the battleships, and almost 2 to 1 if you keep them separate. But the problems don't quite end there, because obviously Jutland, the High Seas Fleet, was wandering around with a squadron of their latest pre-dreadnought battleships floating around with them, which in theory the US Navy could also do. That might even up the numbers somewhat, but if you're evening up the numbers using pre-dreadnoughts, that's never a good thing. I mean, the Virginia and the Connecticut classes, you could quite reasonably make an argument that they might well be superior to the last German pre-dreadnoughts, but not by too much, and they're definitely still well inferior to dreadnought battleships. So, capital ship-wise, I'm afraid the US Navy has quite a big problem here. The larger problem actually isn't even that. The larger problem is that thanks to Congress's penny pinching, although the US Navy has modern battleships, the same cannot really be said for their cruisers. Obviously, they have nothing to counter the German battle cruisers, which is a bit of a major problem, because those battle cruisers can just eat through pretty much anything else that the US Navy can throw at it in terms of a fleet screen. They've got some peace cruisers, which probably aren't even worth taking to the battle. They've got some armoured cruisers. You've got the Pennsylvanias and the Tennessees. But then again, look at Jutland and see just what happens to armoured cruisers when they get into a fight with dreadnoughts or dreadnought-era battle cruisers. You've got a few protected cruisers, but the Germans were rolling around with numerous protected and a few armoured cruisers of their own. Basically, in terms of practical, effective fleet screen combatants, it's effectively the Olympia. There isn't that much else I'd really fancy taking up against most of the German fleet screen, and as good as the Olympia is, it is not standing up to the entire German cruiser and battle cruiser fleet screen. Sorry about that, but that is how it is. A lot of the US Navy cruisers, like the St. Louis class and such, are also a little bit on the slow side. So yeah, this is going to be the largest problem, because the Germans also have lots of destroyers, and the German fleet screen therefore is going to be able to either clear or punch a hole through the American fleet screen relatively easily, and that means the Germans will have the scouting information from first scouting group. The Americans won't, so the Germans should in theory then be able to position themselves for an ideal battle placement, and on top of that, without a fleet screen, the American battle line has very little to protect it from a mass attack by German torpedo boats and destroyers before even so much as a single main gun is fired, and then they have to deal with the rather outnumbered nature of their main fleet. So yeah, that's not the best time to start putting the American fleet up against the German fleet. That said, obviously you have the Nevadas commissioning in 16, you have the Pennsylvanias coming in as well, then the New Mexicos, and that adds another 7 very capable modern dreadnought battleships, all on with 14-inch guns in a period where the Germans just about managed to add Hindenburg, Bayern, and Baden. So yeah, end of the war, possibly a slightly different scenario, although numbers still technically favour the Germans, but individual ship quality begins to swing the US's way, and also by the end of the war, the Americans had just sort of hit Control A, Control C, Control V on their destroyer shipyards and pumped out mass numbers of destroyers, which might even up the fleet screen issue. And we are on to the Discord questions. The Great King asks, could you explain the efficiency of vertical armour used by the Royal Navy ships of the World War II period compared to the thinner angled armour belts used on US battleships in and around the same time? Which one is more ideal? So both sides of that particular argument have their strengths and weaknesses. So the vertical slab armour used by the Royal Navy in the King George V class is a lot easier to manufacture, a lot easier to install, and a lot easier to get at if you need to maintain it, like say if it's been shot up a bit. It also maximises the internal protected volume of the hull, which means that you can get theoretically more stuff into your hull for the same size ship, and it also means that there is a strong possibility that any shell that the armour successfully resists is just going to be a case of, well, it exploded outside, so long, thanks for all the fish. Whereas with an internal belt, which a thinner and angled armour has to be because it angles away from the outer hull. With an angled belt, a shell that detonates on the armour, even if it is successfully resisted by that armour, will have wrecked the outer hull skin and possibly caused minor localised flooding and things like that. The advantages of angled armour are that being internally fitted, there is a chance that the shell might start to detonate upon piercing the outer hull, which increases slightly the effectiveness of the armour itself, assuming that distances and fuse timings work out, but it can't necessarily be counted on. As we saw with the Nelson class, there is also the possibility of incorporating your torpedo defence system into your shell defense system, so that's a possibility for extending protection a little bit further down. But the main advantage of angled armor is that for a particular purpose, which is you tend to use your angled armor on ships where you're expecting to fight at long range, the apparent thickness of your armor in long range engagements increases much more dramatically with angled armor than it does with slab-sided armor. Basically, as the vertical angle of an incoming shell increases, which obviously it will do if it's coming in from further away, that incident angle with the armor belt itself creates an apparent thickness, which is the distance the shell has to travel through the metal to get from one side to the other, and by effectively inducing an additional angle with your angled plate, then that means that this is dramatically increased, because past a certain threshold, the numbers start to go up very quickly, which in theory gives you much more effective protection at long range. and as a result you can then thin down on the armour, which saves on weight, which means you can put that weight to other uses, such as bigger guns, for example. The flip side to that is that obviously if you have a objectively thinner plate of armour, it then means if you do get into a close range gunfight, you could be a little bit stuffed, because that plate is almost certainly not going to resist any incoming shell fire to anything like the degree that a thicker slab-sided plate would. Although you could also argue that if you're in a close range melee combat in a World War II environment with World War II era guns, the chances are that the gun is probably going to punch straight through your armour, regardless of whether or not it's angled and thinner or slab-sided and thicker. So let's look at a typical example that you might be expected. We'll use the British 15-inch 42 caliber gun as our base data point, because it's a common gun and there's a lot of information for it in terms of armour penetration and angle of fall, which there isn't for most Japanese guns, unfortunately. And well, I suppose we could use the Bismarck's guns, but the US Navy wasn't expecting so much to fight the Bismarck as it was anyone else. So I'm just going to use the 15-inch 42 because I can and it's easy. Anyway, so if we look at the armour penetration tables for the 15-inch 42 caliber gun, you would expect, based on the available data, that assuming broadside on impact, no other variables in play, that the World War II era shell from a 15-inch 42 would start to penetrate 12-inch armour, which the Iowa has, at around 21 to 22,000 yards, and it would start to penetrate the 15-inch maximum thickness of a King George V class at somewhere around, because it's not quite clear, but maybe somewhere around 12 to 13,000 yards. Unfortunately, the armour-piercing data for that range bracket goes up in 5,000 yard increments. So on the face of it, you'd think, oh, well, King George V, obvious advantage there. It's got nearly 10,000 yards of extra protection compared to the Iowa. But what happens if we start to plug in angles? So at the sort of 12 to 13,000 yard range that we thought we could penetrate the King George V, the angle of fall is about 8 degrees, and that slight angle has increased the relative thickness of the armour, but only by a very small amount, by about 0.2 of an inch. So that hasn't really affected that distance very much. Now, if we compare that to the Iowa, sitting out there at just over 20,000 yards, the angle of fall is about 19 degrees. Now, a 19-degree angle of fall increases the relative thickness but only by 0.7 of an inch, so 12.7 inches. So there is a little bit of an effect in that the penetration range for the 15-inch 42 probably moves back to around 20,000 yards, but it's not all that much. But once we also factor in the angle of the Iowa's armour slope itself, now all of a sudden, with the combined angle of fall and the angle of the Iowa's slope, the relative thickness of that armour is now about 15.3 inches, sorry. And so actually surprisingly similar to King George V. So all of a sudden, the shell isn't going to penetrate. So obviously the angles decrease. So if we walk it back a little bit to, say, 15,000 yards, at 15,000 yards, you would expect a 15-inch 42 caliber shell on standard charges to be penetrating around 14 inches of armour. And when you incorporate the angle of fall at this range, which is just about around 12 degrees, and incorporate that with the Iowa's existing armour slope, it comes out with an effective thickness of about 14 inches. So you've got suddenly your 12-inch angled armour is offering you protection right down to 15,000 yards, whereas your much thicker, much heavier 15-inch slab-sided armour does offer you a little bit better protection in this case. It offers maybe another 2,000 to 3,000 yards of protection, but it's much, much closer than you might otherwise guess with an apparent 3-inch difference in the thickness of the belt armour. And obviously, when you go further out, the angles get bigger and bigger very quick, and say the numbers get bigger very quickly. So that's against a 15-inch shell, but it gives you an idea of the relative level of effectiveness. The irony here is that against belt armour, the US super heavy shells are actually probably the worst things to take because as a result of their heavy nature, their angle of fall increases quite quickly over range. Obviously, it's designed to help them drop in on deck armour, where the effects are going to be completely different. But a medium to long range hit using a super heavy shell is probably the best case for shooting angled armour. Whereas using something like a high velocity gun that keeps the angles relatively shallow, like say on Bismarck, a high velocity gun is almost the counter as best you can to angled armour because the angle of fall is substantially lower, which means that sudden increase in effective thickness that you get once you get past a certain point with the angled armour calculations doesn't come into effect until much further away. So the ideal gun to take to counter a ship like Iowa or South Dakota with angled internal armour is going to be a high velocity gun, whereas perhaps against a slab-sided ship you want a super heavy shell you just drop through the main deck anyway. Paul from Chicago says, as I understand it, for a brief period in 1860, the French Navy had more steam battleships than the Royal Navy, not counting block ships. They also had some ironclads. Well, they had the Gloire, whereas the Royal Navy didn't have any, obviously building the Warrior. If Louis Napoleon had chosen then to go to war, how would the wooden walls have fared? It's an interesting scenario, but I think the Royal Navy is still coming out on top on this, mainly because the period when the Royal Navy has no ironclads but the French have any, i.e. Gloire, is only about a year. You're looking at August 1860 to August 1861, which is the difference between the commissioning dates of Gloire and Warrior, respectively. Now, during this period, as you said, they did have a few more steam battleships than the Royal Navy, and they had the Gloire. However, as the Battle of Lissa shows, having an ironclad is not necessarily a recipe for success against a steam-powered ship of the line, witness the Kaiser. Although, that said, Gloire obviously would be a very effective combatant, and it would require some rather heroic and unusual shenanigans to try and neutralise the threat. But then again, you are talking about the Royal Navy coming off the age of sail, so unusual and heroic shenanigans are pretty much expected of them. As far as steam battleships goes, their number advantage wasn't too great, and as I covered in the video that covers the transition from sail to steam and iron, one of the bigger factors that has to be taken into account there is that the French steam battleships tended to be smaller. If you were rating them by the old rating system, most of the French ships would have been rated as sort of high thirds, second rates, and low grade first rates, whereas the Royal Navy, albeit with fewer numbers, basically were running what would have been classified before as second rates, first rates, and zeroth rates when you get into the monstrous ships, like the 130 gun plus units that they were putting in the water towards the end of the 1850s. And the Royal Navy still has a superiority in numbers in conventional sail line of battleships. So the French Navy has a small advantage, but in a full-on fleet battle, that is in terms of numbers of steam and iron ships, but in a full-on fleet battle, I would still expect the larger and more powerful Royal Navy ships, along with their greater numbers of sail warships, to probably overwhelm the French steam warships and their accompanying sail warships, at which point It's basically Gloire, whether or not Gloire can tip the balance against quite a large number of Royal Navy ships. And as I said before, something like Gloire, which isn't the world's best designed ironclad, against multiple sort of 130 gunners, I don't think that's going to be quite enough. Although it would have been one hell of a fight. I'd certainly pay money to take my Victorian era popcorn and watch that particular engagement from the walls of Southsea Castle, I can tell you that much. And finally, for this week, Dunk Master Flex asks, what would a fisherless Royal Navy look like? Well, very different, for one thing. Yeah, Fisher pushed modern technology a lot. He effectively dragged the Royal Navy to a certain extent, kicking and screaming out of an era where it was effectively unchallenged, and ships were beginning to slip slightly more into the prestige role than the battle role, and rigorously enforce the idea that no, they were a navy that was here to fight and destroy its enemies, and that was about it. He also scrapped vast numbers of ships that the Royal Navy was keeping around effectively to pad the books, and also because, to be perfectly honest, they were entirely adequate to beat up on smaller powers and random colonials who might feel a bit uppity at the time, but were of basically no use in a modern naval war, and Fisher was all about the modern naval war. So yeah, that was a massive step change for the Navy, and obviously it saved a fantastic amount of money and crew in getting rid of those older ships, which meant that the Royal Navy was then able to expand, build a lot more modern warships and crew them a lot faster than it would have been without him. He was also obviously the main driving force behind HMS Dreadnought, stealing the march and everyone else there. He did invent the battle cruiser, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on how you look at things. As I say, because of the technology, he pressed for the adoption of long-range gunnery, he pressed for the adoption of the turbine engine, and all this kind of stuff. So I suspect that if there was a fisherless Royal Navy, they probably would have eventually been forced to scrap a bunch of older ships, but that would have taken a lot longer. It would have been a more dragged out process. The Navy would have been a bit more risk averse. So you might see either the Satsuma or the South Carolina completing first as the world's first all big gun ships, and the Royal Navy having to respond to those developments. Although that might mean that the Royal Navy might skip the wing turret phase altogether and go for super firing. You never know. The big drive to build to counter Germany would probably still happen, because that was more of a political thing that was separate from Fisher. But as I said, it initially would have been a bit slower to get off the ground because of the whole getting rid of the older ships issue. Battles would have been probably fought at closer range. The Royal Navy was moving towards long distance gunnery anyway, but Fisher really did push for it. The turbine's adoption would have been a bit slower, so maybe the first Royal Navy dreadnoughts might have been still triple expansion engine powered. Although if they're later on, they might have just adopted turbines then. But again, probably wouldn't have had the first turbine equipped battleship. Yeah, there's quite a bit that he influenced. The battle cruiser may or may not come about, but we may well see that sort of intermediate step that the Germans thought was going to happen, which is why they built the Blücher. So the Invincibles might actually well end up being a sort of an all big gun twin 9.2-inch turret farm, as everyone thought they were going to be right up until they popped up with 12-inch guns, which actually has the interesting counterfactual of, with ships like Blücher and its immediate predecessor Scharnhorst, the Scharnhorst class of World War One, an all 9.2-inch Invincible would have some advantage over them, but not so much, which would mean that raiding forces like Admiral Spaes and various other German naval forces, which were fairly rapidly culled by the Royal Navy historically, would probably have lasted a lot longer because the Royal Navy would have had to deploy significantly more ships and a lot more logistical effort to try and actually find the blasted things and engage them on superior terms. So German surface raiders probably would have lasted a lot longer. And caused more damage commensurately, which would have distracted everybody from the main fleet engagement, which eventually probably would have come about. The Royal Navy certainly would have been on a bit of a back foot compared to where it was historically, except for the exploding battlecruiser part, as with less of an emphasis on long-range gunnery. You might have seen the Royal Navy's overall gunnery levels actually deteriorate to worse than the Germans, which would offset their numerical advantage. It is a commonly held misconception that the German gunnery was flat out superior to the British gunnery at Jutland. In actual fact, the two most efficient distinct units in terms of gunnery accuracy at Jutland were the 5th Battle Squadron, made up of the Queen Elizabeths, followed by the Grand Fleet generally. Then you had the German, both the High Seas Fleet Main and 1st Scouting Group, and then you had the rest of the battlecruiser force trailing well down at the bottom. BT's battlecruisers, basically. 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron was actually pretty good at gunnery, but yeah, there you go. So if all of that shifts down, Jutland will probably be a lot closer run thing. The Royal Navy probably still comes out with the strategic victory. But it's probably going to be starting that battle with fewer dreadnought warships, so less of a numerical advantage, and probably not quite as good gunnery as it would have had initially. So yeah, quite the interesting counterfactual. I could go on and on about this, but I don't want to break another record for Drydock length, as these things do take quite a while to render, so I'm going to draw a line under it there and say thank you very much for watching. Hope you all found this enjoyable, and hope to see you again in the next video.